welcome back to my channel. I know I've been MIA for a while, but trust me, your girl is back and better. So today we'll be looking at analyzing arterial blood gas values using the row method. So without further much ado, let's just get right into it. And also, please kindly stay to the end of this video because I have practice questions for you all to practice with. So you would love to want to stay to the end of this video so you fully grasp all the knowledge you need to about arterial blood gas values so that you can be really confident enough in answering these questions. The link to those questions will be in the description box, so please do well to answer them. Get your hands on this question so you become a pro in analyzing arterial blood gas values. So remember, ladies and gentlemen, that we have two major imbalances: the respiratory imbalance and the metabolic imbalance. The respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, the metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. So remember, we said that if it's a respiratory problem, you are looking at the CO2, the carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is the respiratory function indicator. And if it's a metabolic imbalance, you're looking at your bicarbonate ion, that base, the HCO3, because the HCO3 is your metabolic function indicator. Remember, in the last class, we looked at three major steps in analyzing arterial blood gas values. Firstly, we said analyze if it's an acidosis or alkalosis problem. Secondly, we said analyze if it is metabolic or respiratory imbalance. And thirdly, we said identify its state of compensation. So in the first step, in checking if it's acidosis or alkalosis, you have to look at the pH. pH down, that's an acidosis. Acidosis. pH up, that's alkalosis. And the second step is by checking if it is metabolic or respiratory imbalance, because we have to know what imbalance is going on. You have to do this by looking at the CO2 and the HCO3. The CO2, which is the respiratory function indicator, and the HCO3, which is the metabolic function indicator. And as you all know, your lungs control your CO2. You breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide. Let's say in an example where you can't breathe out carbon dioxide, for example, being overdosed on opioid, where your respiratory system is being depressed, you can't get rid of that CO2. What is going to happen? The client is going to be retaining all that CO2. Then the client becomes acidic. So increased CO2 equals to being acidic, because CO2 is directly proportional to the amount of hydrogen ions being produced, that acid. So the more CO2 the client has retained within the body, the more acidic the client is said to be. That is a respiratory acidosis, where you are retaining all that acid. And for another scenario where you are breathing out all that CO2, let's say, for example, you just got chased around the block and the adrenaline got high up, you had to run, you had to probably jump over a fence, something like that. So, and then you are panting, you are hyperventilating, getting rid of all that CO2 than normal. What happens? More CO2 is leaving the body. So the more CO2 leaving the body, the more acid leaving the body. So what's the client left with? The client becomes more basic, more alkalotic. That is that respiratory alkalosis. We looked at all these in the last class. For HCO3, that bicarbonate ion, we all know it plays a vital role in regulating body pH, and it is being controlled by the kidneys. So bicarbonate ion, is that base. The more base a client retains, the more bicarbonate ion that client retains, the more basic the client is. So an increased level of HCO3, if HCO3 is high, that means that client tends to be more basic or more alkalotic. And the more base the client loses, that the more HCO3 the client lets out, the more acidic the client is, because the client is losing all that base. So what's the client left with? The client is left with more acid. So that is in that metabolic acidosis. So if you do this in comparison, if you try to compare them with the pH, you'll be able to actually really analyze arterial blood gas values. First step is checking for the state of compensation. You have to check if it is compensated or fully compensated. They both mean the same thing. You have to check if it is uncompensated, or you have to check if it is partially compensated. So in checking if it is full compensated, the imbalance can be said to be fully compensated if the pH has been brought to the normal value, that normal value of 7.35 to 7.45. Remember in the last class, we talked about how one will make up for the shortcoming of the other. One will either increase or decrease. in relation to the imbalance going on in order to balance up that pH. Looked at that in depth in the last class. So if there has been a compensation and the compensation was complete enough to bring the pH back to its normal value, we would say that's a full compensation, or compensation has occurred there. So looking at partially compensated it just means that the other one has actually compensated for the shortcoming of the other. For example, let's say a metabolic problem is a metabolic acidosis, to be more precise. You can see that the client is retaining that acid, that metabolic acidosis is holding on to acid, while the client has lost so much base, so the client is left with more acid. So what do you think will happen to the CO2? Instead of compensation, the CO2 is going to decrease to be able to balance up that pH. So you see that it will go below that level of 35 to 45. When you see that, you can say, okay, this is a partial compensation. It is only full if at the end of the day the pH was brought back to its normal state. So in the state of uncompensation, uncompensation, I mean nothing happened. The other one did not even stress. It didn't even try to compensate for the shortcoming of the other. So let's stick with that metabolic acidosis. You check the CO2. You see that the CO2 is still within its normal range. You didn't try to decrease, because we have been specific now in metabolic acidosis. You didn't try to decrease to help to balance up that pH. Or if it's a metabolic alkalosis, you didn't try to increase to make up for that metabolic imbalance. So then we can say this is uncompensated. And we looked at this in depth in the last class, but now we are looking at the Rome method today. We are still going to go through those steps and would still be able to say whether it is uncompensated, partially compensated, or fully compensated. Having said all this, I'm going to take it back to the last class where we did say that if it's a respiratory problem, the pH and the CO2 have an inverse relationship. And if it's a metabolic problem, the pH and the HCO3 have the same or direct relationship. For example, if it's a respiratory acidosis, looking at the pH and the CO2, pH is down in acidosis. And in respiratory acidosis, because the client is retaining all that CO2, the CO2 is up. So you can see that in respiratory acidosis, pH is down, CO2 is up. You can see that inverse relationship, and vice versa for respiratory alkalosis. While in metabolic imbalance, they have the same relationship. For example, metabolic alkalosis. Metabolic alkalosis, we are looking at the pH and the HCO3. The pH is going to be up. In alkalosis, the pH is up. Then the HCO3 is also going to be up, because HCO3 is that bicarbonate ion, that base. The client is retaining so much base, so the HCO3 is up, is increased. That's why the body is more basic. So you can see the pH is up and the HCO3 is up. You can see that direct relationship, because I did say in the last class that you would see that you already know how to analyze arterial blood gas values using the Rome method when we discuss it. So I want you to hold on to that knowledge. I want you to have it at the tips of your fingers, not at the back of your mind, please. Have it at the tip of your fingers, because you basically need this knowledge to be able to analyze arterial blood gas values using the Rome method. You'll be able to use this method or this knowledge, this concept, analyzing it with ease. We've been talking, so let's look at what this Rome method stands for. ROME, respiratory opposite metabolic equal. R stands for respiratory, O stands for opposite, M stands for metabolic, and E stands for equal. Rome method. So it's basically saying all I've said, because it's saying that if it's a respiratory problem, the pH and the CO2 are going to be in opposite direction. That's that respiratory opposite. And if it's a metabolic problem, the pH and the HCO3 are going to be equal. That's that metabolic equal. So it's saying that in respiratory acidosis, you are going to have a low pH and a high CO2. You see that opposite direction. And in respiratory alkalosis, you are going to have a high pH and a low CO2. While in metabolic imbalance, for metabolic acidosis now, you are going to have a low pH and you're also going to have a low HCO3. Now let's analyze these arterial blood gas values using the Rome method. So first of all, the first step is analyzing if it is an acidosis or alkalosis problem. Knowing our normal pH, which is 7.35 to 7.45, we have a pH of 7.42 here. And from the last class, we talked about the lower end of the normal value and the higher end of the normal value. So if you are a bit confused about that, it's very important you should have watched the second video before watching this, where we discuss that. So this is at the higher end of the normal value. So we are going to put just by the right side, right pH, and put an arrow showing that the pH is high. So a high pH indicates alkalosis. So in brackets, we'll put alkalosis / base, and just beside it we'll write normal because it's still within the normal range of that 7.35 to 7.45. So to continue with the analysis, we are going to write out Rome, R-O-M-E, like so. Remember, the R and the O go together because we are saying respiratory opposites, meaning if it's a respiratory problem, the pH and the CO2 are always in opposite direction. And M and E go together because if it's a metabolic problem, the pH and the HCO go in equal direction. So have that at the tip of your fingers. Then we'll write out this as we already deduced. So now let's look at the CO2. CO2 is 55, and given the normal range to 35 to 45, this is higher than the normal value. So beside the R, we are going to put an increased arrow showing that the CO2 is high. So now let's compare it, the pH and the CO2. Are they in opposite direction? The answer is no. So at that O, we are going to put an X there showing that they are not in opposite direction. So this is not a respiratory problem. In bracket of the R, we could also write acid there showing that the CO2 is increased, and that pH is base, so they don't even match, base and acid. So now let's look at the HCO3. The value is 30, the normal range is 22 to 26. So we can see that this value is high. So beside the M, we put high, that high arrow showing that it is increased. So if you compare it with the pH, you can see that the pH and the HCO3, that metabolic, are both in the same direction. So they're in equal direction. So we can say this is a metabolic problem. And just beside it, we could put base. Then at the E, we'll give tick it good, showing that yes, the metabolic and the pH are in equal direction. So this is a metabolic problem. And from what we've deduced, pH being high and metabolic being high, this is a metabolic alkalosis. So now let's look for the state of compensation. Was the compensation complete enough to bring the pH back to its normal value? Yes, the pH is in its normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. So this is a fully compensated or compensated metabolic alkalosis. Analyzing its arterial blood gas values, looking at the pH 7.61. So this is higher than the normal range, and we know with this value we can deduce that this is an alkalosis. So just write pH by the right hand side, pull that increased arrow showing that it is high, in bracket writing alkalosis / base. Then we go down to write Rome, just like so, R-O-M-E, having it in mind that the R and O go together and the M and E also go together. So looking at the CO2, we can see CO2 is 22. So beside the R, we put the downward arrow showing that the CO2 is below that normal range. Then the O, that's the opposite. We look at the pH and the R. Are they in opposite direction? Yes, they're in opposite direction because it has to be in opposite direction for it to be a respiratory problem. So tick it good, showing that this is a respiratory imbalance. And just beside the R, we could put in brackets base because of that CO2 is low, and if the client is losing CO2, the client is retaining base. So at that point, it is basic. So we can see that the pH, which is base, and the R, which is base, they do match. Then we go over to the M. Looking at the HCO3, it is 25, which is within the normal range. So beside the M, we could write normal. Then just beside the E, we'll put an X because the pH and the HCO3 are not in equal direction. So it is not a metabolic problem. And we know when the pH is high and the CO2 is low, that respiratory indicator, it is a respiratory alkalosis. So we can deduce that this is a respiratory alkalosis. Checking for compensation, we'll look at the pH. pH is not within the normal range, so compensation was not complete enough to bring the pH back to its normal range. So it's a respiratory problem. We'll look at the HCO3 for the compensation. The HCO3 is still within the normal range, showing that it didn't do anything to compensate for this respiratory alkalosis. So we'll put that it is an uncompensated respiratory alkalosis because the metabolic indicator is still within the normal range. pH 7.34 is acidic. So write out pH just like so, put that downward arrow showing it is below the normal range, in bracket write acidic. We're going to write out Rome, ROME as usual. Then look at the CO2. CO2 is 24, which is below the normal range. So beside the arrow, go ahead and put that downward arrow, and in bracket you could write base. Comparing the pH to the CO2, are they in opposite direction? The answer is no. So beside that O, put an X showing that this is not a respiratory imbalance. So looking at the HCO3 is 20, which is below the normal range. So beside the M, we could put a downward arrow. And also beside that M in brackets, we could write acidic because the client is losing that base, so the client is left with acid. And that does rhyme with the pH. So beside the E, we'll tick it good because comparing the pH and the metabolic indicator, that's that HCO3, they are both in the same direction, low. So this is a metabolic problem. When the pH is low and the HCO3 is also low, that metabolic indicator, we know that this is a metabolic acidosis. And as you can see, the pH in bracket acid and the metabolic in bracket acid, they rhyme. So we already know that this is an acidotic problem or an acidosis. Looking at the state of compensation, let's look at the pH. Was the compensation enough to bring the pH back to its normal value? No. The pH is not within the normal range, so it's not a full compensation. So now let's look at the CO2. CO2 is 24, and we can see that the CO2 is not within the normal range. So this is a partial compensation because when the CO2, which is supposed to compensate, is not within the normal range, we can see that this is a partial compensation. It can only be full if that pH was brought back to normal. Hence, partially compensated metabolic acidosis. Thank you, ladies and gents, for staying to the end of this video. Please do not forget to like, comment, subscribe. Just leave your comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think about this video, and I'll do well to attend to every one of them. I hope that by now you fully understand how to analyze arterial blood gas values. Like, even if you have been woken up from sleep, you would analyze the value ASAP without stress. So please, thank you. See you again. It's your favorite RN, Anita. And please do not forget to go check out those practice questions. Answer them so you get really good at analyzing arterial blood gas values. So till we meet again. Bye bye.